Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku controlled all villains in the multiverse. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was ending in a symphony of grit and screams. Jaka's city was no longer a city. It was a crater, a gaping wound gouged into the earth, bleeding dust and smoke into a sky the color of a day-old bruise. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of ozone, was a physical weight on Izuku Midoriya's lungs. Every breath was a shard of glass. Every heartbeat was a drumbeat in a funeral march. He was a ruin in a landscape of ruins. His costume, once a vibrant symbol of hope modeled after his idol, was now little more than shredded green fabric clinging to a body pushed far beyond its breaking point. His right arm was a mangled mess of purple and black, the bones screaming in protest with every twitch of his fingers. His left leg buckled with each desperate step, a lightning rod for agony. The power of one for all, a sacred torch passed down through generations, now felt like a wildfire consuming him from the inside out. Green-black lightning, erratic and furious, danced across his skin, not a sign of power but of a system on the verge of catastrophic failure. Across the field of churned earth and shattered concrete stood the cause of it all. Tamura Shigaraki. Or what was left of him, now a grotesque vessel for the will of all for one. He was a nightmare given flesh, a god of decay whose mere presence seemed to leach the color and hope from the world. Tendrils of black and red energy writhed from his back, lashing out with a life of their own, while a manic, chillingly familiar grin stretched his scarred lips. "Is that all, little hero?" Shigaraki's voice was a discordant duet, the raspy, petulant whine of the man-child he had been, layered over the deep, confident baritone of his master. "I thought the ninth wielder would be a grander spectacle. But you're just a broken toy." Deku spat a glob of blood onto the gray dust. "I'm still standing." The words were gravel in his throat. He could feel the vestiges within him, a silent, anxious chorus. Nana Shimura's desperate urgency, Daigoro Banjo's tactical fury, Yoichi Shigaraki's profound, aching sorrow for the monster his brother had created. They were his strength, but they were also a constant reminder of the weight of his legacy, a legacy he was currently failing. He looked past Shigaraki, his vision blurring at the edges. He saw Endeavor, the #1 hero, locked in a hellish ballet with a Heian Nomu, his flames painting stark, fleeting portraits of destruction against the gloom. He saw Bakugo, Kaken, being tended to by Best Jeanist, his chest a bloody ruin from the very attack that should have killed Deku. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold stone in his gut. He saw Shoto Todoroki, his ice and fire a desperate bulwark against the tide of lesser villains, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. Everywhere, heroes were falling. Friends were dying. The world he had sworn to protect, the future he had promised to build, was turning to ash before his eyes. A new wave of rage, pure and incandescent, surged through him, momentarily silencing the pain. It was the primal, desperate fury of a protector watching his flock be slaughtered. He pushed off his good leg, float activating in a clumsy, lurching burst. Black whip erupted from his arms, not as precise tendrils but as thick, thorny cables of raw energy, lashing toward the monster. More of the same. Shigaraki laughed, meeting the onslaught with his own. His tendrils were faster, sharper. They parried and pierced Deku's whips, the impact sending jolts of agony up his already shattered arms. Deku gritted his teeth, pouring more of himself into the quirk. He was burning through his life force, he knew. He could feel it, a hollowing out sensation in the core of his being. But what was his life worth if he couldn't save anyone, save them? The thought was no longer a strategy. It was a prayer. A mantra. The singular, all-consuming purpose that had defined him since he was a quirkless, crying child watching a video of All Might. Save everyone. He used smokescreen, flooding the immediate area with a thick, cloying cloud. It was a momentary reprieve, a gasp of air before plunging back into the abyss. He shot through the smoke, gene storing and releasing kinetic energy in a series of explosive movements. 45%. 100%. He was tearing his own muscles apart, but he had to get closer. He burst through the other side of the smoke, his fist cocked back, the image of All Might's final, defiant punch against all for one burning in his mind. Detroit. Shigaraki was waiting. His eyes, burning with malevolent red light, tracked Deku's every move. The grin on his face was one of triumph. Predictable. A rivet-stabbed tendril, faster than Deku could process, shot not at his fist, but at his chest. Deku tried to twist, to use danger sense's frantic buzzing to evade, but he was too slow, too broken. The tendril, hard as diamond and sharp as a scalpel, punched through the tattered remains of his costume, through muscle and sinew, and straight through his torso, narrowly missing his heart but shredding a lung. The world dissolved into a universe of pure, white-hot pain. The air was stolen from his lungs. The power in his fist fizzled into nothing. He hung there, impaled, a gruesome marionette dangling from his destroyer's string. His vision swam, the edges turning a dark, fuzzy gray. Shigaraki's triumphant face was the last thing he saw clearly. "This is the end of the line, Izuku Midoriya," the dual voice whispered, savoring the moment. "The age of heroes dies with you." Deku's mind, reeling from the agony, began to retreat. He was dying. He had failed. Everyone he loved was going to die. No. No. A spark ignited in the deepest, most primal part of his soul. It was not the noble fire of a hero. It was the raw, animalistic desperation of a cornered creature. The singular, all-consuming thought that had driven him his entire life intensified, magnified by the lens of his imminent death. It was no longer just a wish. It was a command screamed into the void. Save everyone. He didn't just think it. He felt it with every dying cell in his body. It was a demand hammered out on the anvil of his soul. Stop all the fighting. He wasn't asking for help. He was trying to bend reality to his will. The sheer, impossible force of his desire, amplified by the generational power of 9 lives lived in service and sacrifice, pushed against the fabric of his own existence. And something broke. It wasn't a sound. It was a shift. A tremor in the foundation of his being. One for all, pushed past every conceivable limit, overloaded not with power, but with intent. It had been a stockpile of physical energy, but now, fueled by Deku's dying wish, it became something else entirely. A singularity. A psychic conduit. The first vestige to react was Yoichi. Deku felt not a voice, but an impression of pure shock from the first user. It was as if Deku had reached for a flashlight, and had instead grabbed the heart of a star. The power surged, not outwards into his limbs, but inwards, into his consciousness. The pain from his wound vanished, not because it was gone, but because it was rendered insignificant, a single drop of rain in a hurricane. His mind, his very consciousness, was ripped from his body and flung across an infinite, screaming void. The first connection was a jolt, an alien consciousness crashing into his own. It was Shigaraki. For a nanosecond, Deku was Tamura Shigaraki. He felt the gnawing emptiness, the itching rage, the suffocating weight of all for one's will, the childish glee of destruction. It was foul, a psychic taste like spoiled milk and rust. He recoiled instinctively, but it was too late. The dam had broken, a floodgate opened, 1,000,000 minds crashed into his. Then 10 million. 1 billion. It was a tsunami of pure, undiluted malevolence. Each mind was a unique flavor of poison, a different shard of broken glass scraping against the inside of his soul. He felt the cold, theatrical cruelty of Dabi, the burning hatred for his father, a living, breathing inferno in his mind. He felt the twisted, blood-soaked adoration of Himiko Toga, her sense of love and her desire to kill so intertwined they were one and the same. He felt the greedy, nihilistic pragmatism of the countless members of the Paranormal Liberation Front, their minds a cacophony of selfish desires. But it didn't stop there. The singularity in his quirk hadn't just reached across a battlefield. It had torn through the walls of his reality. His consciousness stretched, thin to an impossible degree, and snapped across dimensions. He was everywhere at once. The silent scream intensified, becoming a chorus of cosmic horror. He felt the thoughts of a crime boss in a city called Gotham. This man's mind was a meticulously ordered labyrinth of ambition and logic, built around a warped obsession with penguins and umbrellas. It was jarringly different from the raw chaos he'd felt so far, but no less corrupt. Then came another, far worse. A mind so utterly insane, so gleefully chaotic, that it felt like a psychic razor blade. It was a cackling, unending shriek of laughter that promised pain and punchlines in equal measure. A painted smile, a purple suit, the smell of cheap makeup and gasoline. The thought clear as a bell amidst the madness, a brand new toy. This should be fun. The perspective shifted again. He was in space, looking down from a sterile, high-tech throne. He felt an arrogance so profound it was a physical force, a contempt for all other life that was as natural to this being as breathing. A planet full of green-skinned aliens pleaded for their lives below, and the emotion he felt in response was a cold, bored amusement. A name echoed in the vast emptiness of this consciousness, Frisia. Another shift. A battlefield drenched in blood and rain. He stood before two armies of reanimated corpses, a strange, patterned mask on his face. His mind was a vortex of ancient grief and bitter, unyielding resolve. A desire for a perfect peace born from a lifetime of war and loss, a peace he would achieve through ultimate control. He felt the power of a captured god thrumming within him, and a name surfaced from the depths of this ancient soul, Madara Uchiha. He felt the cold, patient intellect of a soul reaper in a white prison, a being whose plots spanned centuries and who viewed all others as pieces on a board. He felt the slithering, immortal ambition of a noseless wizard obsessed with conquering death. He felt the primal hunger of a hive mind of insected aliens, the calculated brutality of a galactic warlord in black armor, the petty greed of 1,000 street-level thugs across 1,000,000 different cities. It was a chorus of every evil thought, every dark desire, every cruel ambition from every villain in every corner of the multiverse. They were all screaming at once, their collective malice a psychic poison flooding his system. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya. He was a nexus, a switchboard for the accumulated evil of all creation, and through it all, his desperate, dying command echoed, "Stop." On the battlefield of Jakku, time seemed to crawl to a halt. Bakugo, who had just struggled to his feet with Genis's help, was the first to notice. He had been screaming Deku's name, a raw, terrified sound torn from his throat as he watched Shigaraki impale his childhood friend. He was about to lunge forward, consequences be damned, when it happened. Shigaraki froze. His hand, cocked back to deliver a final, decaying blow, stopped inches from Deku's face. The triumphant, sadistic glee vanished from his expression, replaced by a look of utter, childlike bewilderment. His eyes, which had been glowing with red malice, dimmed to their natural color. He blinked, as if waking from a long and terrible dream. The writhing tendrils on his back went limp, slumping to the ground like dead snakes. Across the crater, the effects were simultaneous and absolute. Dalby was in the middle of incinerating a group of heroes with a colossal wave of azure flame. His attack was fueled by a lifetime of pain and a singular, all-consuming need for revenge. His face was a mask of ecstatic fury. And then, it went blank. The torrent of blue fire vanished as if a switch had been flipped, leaving only shimmering, superheated air and the stunned, untouched heroes. Dalby stood perfectly still, his arms outstretched, the turquoise flames that normally licked at his scarred skin sputtering out one by one. Himiko Toga, in her twice disguise, was bearing down on a terrified Uraraka, a knife held high, a joyful, lovesick smile on her face. The knife stopped its descent. Her smile faded. The blade slipped from her slack fingers and clattered onto the rubble. She stared at Uraraka, not with predatory obsession, but with a vacant, distant look, as if seeing a stranger for the first time. Every single member of the Paranormal Liberation Front, from the high-ranking lieutenants to the lowest grunt, stopped dead. A villain swinging a pipe let it drop. A gnome mid-charge skidded to a halt, its monstrous roar dying in its throat. The war, a cacophony of explosions, screams, and clashing powers, ended. It was replaced by a silence so sudden, so profound, it was more shocking than any explosion. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the skeletal remains of buildings, the distant crackle of fires, and the ragged, confused breathing of the heroes. Endeavor landed heavily near Deku's suspended body, his flames extinguished, his eyes wide with disbelief. What is this?" he breathed, looking at the thousands of villains standing like statues across the ruined landscape. They weren't surrendering. They weren't retreating. They were just off. Todoroki stumbled to a stop, his body steaming from the exertion of his quirks. He scanned the scene, his analytical mind struggling to find a rational explanation. "It's not a quirk," he muttered, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Not one I've ever seen. It's too total." Bakugo was shaking, a mixture of rage and terror coiling in his stomach. He looked at the blank-faced Shigaraki, then at the limp, bleeding form of Deku. This was wrong. This unnatural peace was more terrifying than the war had been. "Deku," he whispered, the name a strange, unfamiliar thing on his tongue. "What the hell did you do?" Suspended in the air, Deku was oblivious to the eerie calm he had created. His mind was a battlefield of its own, far more terrible than the one below. The silent scream of a billion villains was tearing his consciousness to shreds. The flashes of other worlds, other lives, other evils, were coming faster now, a chaotic montage of cosmic depravity. A giant purple being on a throne of stone, a gauntlet glittering on his hand, feeling a profound sense of weary destiny. A man in a green and yellow uniform, his face a mask of metal, roaring defiance against an unseen force in a castle of science and sorcery. A pale, red-eyed creature whose very name inspired fear, holding a wand of you, feeling a momentary, baffling urge to practice horticulture. It was too much. The human mind, even one fortified by the will of 9 heroes, was not designed to contain this. It was like trying to pour the ocean into a teacup. The cup was shattering. He felt a final, desperate surge of his own identity. Izuku Midoriya. I am Izuku Midoriya. He clung to that fact like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. He remembered his mother's smile. He remembered All Might's booming laughter. He remembered Uraraka's kind face, Ida's earnest chopping motions, Kaken's explosive rivalry. These memories, these anchors to his soul, were all that kept him from being completely annihilated, from dissolving into the multiversal ocean of evil. He let out a scream. It was not the silent, psychic scream of the villains. It was a real, physical sound, torn from his ruined lungs. It was a cry of pure, undiluted agony, a sound of a soul being ripped apart. It echoed across the silent battlefield, a final, human punctuation marked to an impossible event. Then, his consciousness, unable to bear the strain for another second, snapped. The void rushed in, and he knew no more. Shigaraki, released from his mental paralysis by the severing of Deku's active focus, stumbled back. The tendril holding Deku up dissolved into nothingness. Deku's body fell from the sky, a broken puppet with its strings cut, and landed with a sickening thud in the gray dust. For a moment, no one moved. The spell was broken, but the echo remained. Shigaraki looked at his hands, then at Deku's still form, a profound confusion warring with his ingrained malice. He took a hesitant step forward, the instinct to kill reasserting itself. Before he could take a second, a pillar of ice erupted, encasing his legs. An explosion rocked him backward. Todoroki and Bakugo stood over Deku's body, their expressions ferocious. The war was over, but the fight for their friend had just begun. The first thing he was aware of was the color white. A flat, sterile, unforgiving white that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the ceiling of a hospital room. He knew it well. The second thing was the smell. Antiseptic and clean linen. A stark contrast to the dust and blood that had filled his last waking moments. The third was the sound. A soft, rhythmic beeping from a machine to his left. The steady pulse of a life that, against all odds, was still being lived. Izuku Midoriya slowly opened his eyes. Pain was a distant, hazy memory. His body felt heavy, leaden but whole. He could feel bandages wrapped tightly around his chest and arms. He tried to move his fingers and was rewarded with a faint, sluggish twitch. "He's awake." A calm, female voice. A nurse. Footsteps approached his bed. A kind face with tired eyes looked down at him. "Midoriya-kun. Welcome back. Don't try to move too much. You gave us all quite a scare." He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. All that came out was a dry, rasping croak. The nurse helped him sip some water from a cup with a straw. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "Wah." He finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What happened?" "The war." "Shigaraki?" The nurse smiled, a genuine, relieved expression. "It's over, Midoriya-kun. It's all over. You heroes won. He closed his eyes. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy washing over him. We won. They had done it. The sacrifices, the pain, it had meant something. But then, the memories came trickling back, fragmented and nightmarish. The pain of being impaled. The desperate wish. The flood. The silent, screaming chorus. He tensed. The villains. It's the strangest thing, the nurse said, fluffing his pillow. We've never seen anything like it. After you fell, the League of Villains, they just stopped. Shigaraki was captured. Dabi, Toga, all of them. They put up a fight, of course, but it was disorganized. Like their heart wasn't in it. But that's not the half of it. She walked over to the corner of the room and turned on the small television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing a news anchor with a look of utter bewilderment. And reports are still pouring in from all over the globe, the anchor was saying, her voice a mixture of excitement and confusion. It's being called the Great Surrender or the Day of Stillness. At approximately 14:30 Japan Standard Time, coinciding with the end of the battle at Jaka City, every known and registered villain, from petty thieves to the heads of international crime syndicates, simultaneously ceased all hostile activities. The screen cut to footage from various cities. In New York, a supervillain known for his mechanical octopus arms was shown walking into a police precinct, calmly placing his metal appendages on the counter, and waiting to be arrested. In Russia, the leader of a notorious villain organization was found weeping in a public park, begging for forgiveness. The camera panned across a line of Yakuza members in Tokyo, all kneeling in perfect formation outside their headquarters, their heads bowed to the ground, waiting patiently for the authorities. Law enforcement agencies worldwide are overwhelmed, the anchor continued, her voice trembling slightly. Prisons are at capacity. Experts are at a total loss. Psychologists, sociologists, quirk analysts. No one can explain it. It is, without exaggeration, the single most significant event in modern history. For the first time since the dawn of quirks, the world is at peace. Deku stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor began to accelerate. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a dream. The silent screen was gone, but he could still feel an echo of it at the very edge of his consciousness. A faint, background hum. The psychic static of a billion caged minds, from his world and from others, all held in a state of unnatural quiet. They hadn't surrendered. He had made them. He, Izuku Midoriya, the boy who just wanted to save everyone, had become the greatest villain of them all. He was not their savior. He was their jailer. And his prison spanned the multiverse. The days that followed were a special kind of hell, a quiet, sterile purgatory where the only screams were the ones inside Izuku Midoriya's head. He healed with the unnatural speed that One for All afforded him, the gaping wound in his chest knitting itself closed, the shattered bones in his limbs mending with a dull, persistent ache. The doctors called it miraculous. Recovery Girl, visiting from the ruins of Ue, called it a testament to his spirit. Izuku knew it was just his body's desperate attempt to keep up with a soul that was coming apart at the seams. He spent his waking hours in a state of forced denial. The Great Surrender was a fluke, a coincidence. A cosmic miracle. Maybe an unknown hero with a global-scale pacification quirk had finally made their debut at the most opportune moment. Maybe the psychic backlash from Shigaraki's defeat had temporarily scrambled the neurology of every villain on the planet. He clung to these theories like a man overboard clings to driftwood, knowing the ocean was vast and deep beneath him. The feeling was still there, though. The connection. It was no longer the deafening, soul-shredding chorus of malice from the battlefield. Now, it was a faint, ever-present hum at the very edge of his perception, like the buzz of a distant power line or the low thrum of a city heard from a high-rise apartment. It was the background radiation of a billion caged wills. If he didn't focus on it, he could almost pretend it wasn't there. Almost. He would watch the news, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. The world was celebrating. There were parades in streets that had, weeks ago, been battlegrounds. Politicians gave soaring speeches about a new dawn of peace. Pundits debated the long-term societal effects of a world without crime. It was everything he had ever fought for, A world where children could play outside without fear, where heroes were a symbol of inspiration rather than a necessary line of defense. It was a beautiful, perfect, unforgivable lie. He felt like a ghost at his own victory party. His friends visited, their faces bright with relief and concern for him. Uraraka brought him a mochi assortment, her smile as radiant as ever, though her eyes held a deep worry. Ida, ever the class representative, came with a detailed, laminated get-well-soon card signed by everyone in Class 1A, and lectured him gently on the importance of proper recuperation. Even Kaken came, standing awkwardly by the door for a full 5 minutes, grunting something that sounded vaguely like "Don't you dare die again, you damn nerd," before storming out, leaving behind a small, expensive box of premium, All Might-themed curry. Each visit was a fresh twist of the knife. They saw a hero recovering from his wounds. He saw a monster hiding in plain sight. They celebrated the peace he had wrought, and he had to smile and nod, the truth a toxic, choking lump in his throat. The illusion of his denial, fragile as a spider's web, was shattered on the 5th day of his recovery. He was watching the afternoon news, the volume turned low. The anchor was covering a human interest story about the societal shift. The footage showed a bustling shopping district, people walking with a lightness and ease that was once unthinkable. Then, the camera zoomed in on a frantic scene. A man in a hoodie had just snatched a woman's purse and was sprinting down the crowded street. It was a jarring sight. The first reported crime in days. A tiny, ugly crack in the perfect facade of his new world. Izuku sat up, his body tensing. He watched the man weave through the stunned crowd, a look of desperate, wild-eyed panic on his face. He was young, probably not much older than Izuku himself. The woman was crying. Onlookers were frozen, unsure how to react to this forgotten specter of mundane evil. A thought, unbidden and sharp, pierced through Izuku's mind. It wasn't a heroic declaration. It was a simple, weary, and utterly commanding flicker of intent. Why would you do that? It's wrong. Just stop. Give it back. Turn yourself in. The thought was barely formed before he felt it. The hum. The psychic static at the edge of his awareness sharpened for a fraction of a second, a specific frequency suddenly resonating with his will. It felt like a string, previously slack, had been pulled taut between him and that distant, running figure. On the television screen, the purse snatcher skidded to a halt in the middle of the street, his sneakers squealing on the pavement. The panicked look on his face dissolved, replaced by the same slack-jawed, vacant confusion Izuku had seen on Shigaraki. He stood motionless for a beat, cars swerving around him. Then, with the jerky, unnatural movements of a marionette, he turned around. He walked back to the crying woman, his steps wooden and automatic. He held out the purse. His mouth opened, and a strained, tearful apology tumbled out. Then, he turned again and began walking, in a daze, toward the nearest police kiosk, his hands held out in front of him, as if already waiting for the cuffs. The news anchor was speechless. The camera crew was in a frenzy. Izuku's blood ran cold. The remote control slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. The rhythmic beeping of his heart monitor began to climb, a frantic, electronic testament to his horror. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a miracle. It was him. He had just reached across the city with his mind and stripped a man of his free will over a stolen handbag. The sheer, effortless totality of it was breathtakingly horrible. He hadn't strained. He hadn't focused. He had simply wished it, and the universe had obeyed. A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled out of bed, ignoring the protest of his healing muscles, and barely made it to the small bathroom before he was violently sick. He braced himself over the toilet, his body shaking, retching until there was nothing left but dry, heaving sobs. He stared at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. His eyes were wide and haunted, set in a face too young to carry such a terrible burden. Dark circles, born not of physical exhaustion but of psychic strain, were etched beneath them. He raised a trembling hand, looking at his scarred fingers. These were the hands of a hero. They had saved people, protected the innocent, carried the torch of one for all. Now, he saw them for what they were, the controls. The levers and switches for a billion puppets scattered across infinity. The horror was quickly followed by a terrifying, scientific curiosity. He had to know. He had to understand the shape and scope of this power. This curse. Was it limited to his world? How far did it reach? What were its limits? Ignoring every instinct that screamed at him to stop, to crawl back into his bubble of denial, he knew he couldn't. A jailer had to know the size of his prison. He sat on the edge of his bed, the room quiet save for the frantic beeping of the monitor. He closed his eyes, took a shaky breath, and did the unthinkable. He deliberately focused on the hum. He reached out with his mind, not with a command, but with a question. A search. He let the memory from the battlefield guide him. The flash of a cackling, chaotic mind. A painted smile, green hair, a purple suit. An avatar of pure, nihilistic madness. He focused on that feeling, that specific frequency of insanity within the cosmic static. The connection slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. His hospital room vanished. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya. He was in a small, padded cell, the world viewed through a lens of profound, gleeful derangement. His senses were assaulted. The smell of old sweat, stale air, and something acridly chemical. The feel of a rough straitjacket cinched tight around his arms. The sound of his own, high-pitched, unhinged laughter echoing off the walls. But it was the thoughts that were the true violation. There was no logic, no reason, just a kaleidoscope of violent, hilarious, terrible ideas. He felt the phantom joy of carving a smile into a terrified face. He felt the exquisite comedy of a perfectly timed explosion. He saw the world not as a place of people and dreams, but as a giant, boring stage set, just waiting for a splash of chaos to make it interesting. He felt a deep, abiding hatred for a grim-faced man in a bat costume, a hatred that was the closest thing this mind had to a centering principle. Batsy, 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 the thoughts giggled. You lock me up, but the whole world's an asylum, and you're just another inmate. Oh, what's this? A new voice in the chorus? A little green songbird in my head? Let's play. The sheer force of the Joker's madness, his utter, joyful embrace of his own evil, was like a psychic acid. It burned. Izuku felt his own identity, his own sense of right and wrong, beginning to fray at the edges, threatened by this hurricane of insanity. He recoiled with a strangled cry, tearing his consciousness away. He was back in his hospital room, sprawled on the floor, gasping for air as if he had just surfaced from a deep, cold ocean. His nose was bleeding, a thick trickle of crimson running down his lip. The taste of copper filled his mouth. He scrambled back, crab-walking until his back hit the wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had done more than just see through the Joker's eyes. For a terrifying second, he had shared his mind, felt his thoughts, been tainted by his madness. And the Joker had felt him. A little green songbird. The puppet had felt the puppeteer's touch. It took him 10 minutes to stop shaking. The temptation to stop, to never, ever reach out like that again, was overwhelming. But he knew he couldn't. He had to know if they were all like that. Were they all just mindless puppets, or were some of them aware of their strings? He wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his sleeve, his resolve hardening into a grim, joyless thing. He sat back on the bed, his posture rigid. He needed a different target. Not chaos. Intellect, calculation. He remembered another flash, a cold, analytical presence in a white prison. A sole orchestrator. Aizen. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He reached out again, searching for that specific signature of supreme arrogance and transcendent intellect. He found it. This time, the connection was completely different. There was no sensory overload, no chaotic rush. It was like laying his hand on a perfectly smooth, impossibly cold pane of obsidian glass. He wasn't pulled in. He was simply there. A silent observer to a silent consciousness. He saw what Aizen saw, the stark, white walls of his subterranean prison in the Siriidii. He felt what Aizen felt, absolute, unruffled calm. He was bound head to toe in magical seals, deprived of all senses, yet his mind was a universe of its own, running through thousand-year plans, deconstructing the nature of reality, and contemplating the philosophical nuances of power. There was no madness here. No rage. Only a vast, patient, and utterly confident intellect. Izuku tried to probe deeper, to understand the source of this man's ambition. And then, the obsidian glass looked back. Izuku felt a jolt, as if he had touched a live wire. A thought, not his own, but directed at him, echoed in the mental space with perfect, cutting clarity. How fascinating. An external spiritual pressure attempting to assert dominance over my own. It feels nascent, unrefined, immensely powerful, yet wielded with the clumsy desperation of a child who has just discovered fire. You have managed to suppress my will, but you cannot suppress my awareness. So tell me, unknown entity, what is your grand design? What is the purpose of this universal subjugation? Izuku ripped his consciousness away, a gasp escaping his lips. He clutched his head, a splitting headache blooming behind his eyes. This was so much worse. The Joker was a wild animal, aware of the cage but too insane to care about the zookeeper. Aizen was a genius scientist, trapped in a glass box, who was already studying the molecular structure of the glass and the habits of his captor. He wasn't just aware, he was analyzing. He was treating the ultimate violation of his free will as the most interesting puzzle he had ever encountered. The multiversal scale of his power was no longer an abstract concept. It was a concrete, terrifying reality. He was holding the leash of mad dogs and genius monsters, and some of them were looking right back up the leash at him. The weight of it all finally crashed down on him. This wasn't saving people. This was a violation on a scale that had no name. A hero fought for freedom, for choice, for the right of people to be better. He had eliminated that choice. He hadn't defeated evil, he had caged it, along with the very concept of free will that made heroism meaningful. He had created a world of perfect safety, a world of absolute order, a world that was a beautiful, sprawling, cosmic prison. And he was its sole, lonely, terrified warden. He thought of the quirkless boy he had been, crying in front of his computer, watching All Might save people with a smile. That boy had dreamed of being a hero who could give people hope. What would that child think of him now? He hadn't become a hero. He had become a tyrant, a god of control, the very thing heroes fought against. He was a walking, breathing paradox, a heroic heresy. A soft knock on his door startled him from his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he mumbled, hastily wiping his face and trying to compose himself. The door opened, and the skeletal form of Toshinori Yagi, All Might, shuffled in. He was holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies, and his signature smile, though strained on his gaunt face, was wide and genuine. "Young Midoriya, I heard you were awake," he said, his voice full of warmth and relief. He placed the flowers on the bedside table. You look like you've been through a war. But you're here. You're alive." All Might, Izuku breathed, his throat tightening. Of all the people he didn't want to face right now, his idol, his mentor, the man who had given him everything, was at the top of the list. "The whole world is celebrating, my boy," All Might continued, pulling up a chair. His eyes were shining with a pride that made Izuku's stomach clench with guilt. "Peace. Real, lasting peace. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. After everything All for One did, after the rise of Shigaraki, I was beginning to fear the darkness was finally winning. But you, all of you, you turned the tide. And this great surrender, it's a miracle. A sign that the world is finally ready to heal." Izuku couldn't speak. He just stared at his hands, which were clenched into fists on the scratchy hospital blanket. All Might's smile faltered slightly as he took in the boy's demeanor. He saw the dark circles, the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes were fixed on nothing. This wasn't the look of a triumphant hero resting after a great victory. This was the look of a haunted soldier returning from a battle he was still fighting in his head. "Izuku?" he asked, his voice softening, dropping the heroic persona. "Are you all right?" "Your injuries. They're fine," Izuku mumbled, his voice flat. "Recovery girl, she's amazing." "It's not just your injuries, is it?" Toshinori pressed gently. "I've visited you every day. Even when you were unconscious, you seemed troubled. Tense. I've seen that look before. It's the look of someone carrying a great burden. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, my boy." The irony was so thick Izuku could have choked on it. He was carrying the weight of all worlds. The words rose in his throat, a desperate, silent scream for help. It was me, All Might. I did this. I'm controlling them. All of them. I'm a monster. Help me. He opened his mouth. He looked into the proud, hopeful eyes of the man who believed in him more than anyone. He saw the symbol of peace, the paragon of freedom and choice. How could he tell him that he had become the symbol of control? How could he confess a truth so monstrous it would shatter the very foundation of this newfound peace and break his mentor's heart in the process? He couldn't. The shame was a physical barrier. A hand clamped over his mouth. I'm just tired, Izuku finally said, the lie tasting like ash. It was a hard fight. I'm still processing everything. Tashinori watched him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and analytical. He wasn't a fool. He knew his successor better than anyone. He knew there was something more, something deep and dark that the boy was hiding. But he also knew not to push. Not yet. Of course, he said, forcing his smile to return. Of course you are. Rest, my boy. You've earned it. The world is safe now. You can afford to rest. He patted Izuku's shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting, but the touch felt like a brand. When he finally left, closing the door softly behind him, Izuku was left alone once more in the suffocating silence of the room. He looked at the cheerful yellow daisies, then back at his own trembling hands. The world was safe. But he was not, and he was utterly, cosmically alone, the sole puppeteer on an infinite stage, with a billion strings wrapped around his heart. The silence was the worst part. In the weeks following his release from the hospital, Izuku Midoriya came to learn that there are many kinds of silence. There was the peaceful quiet of a library, the companionable silence between friends, and the solemn silence of remembrance. This was none of those. The silence that had descended upon the world was a predatory thing, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered not just noise, but intent. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting for a judgment that had already been passed. His own mind was the epicenter of this unnatural calm. The constant, terrifying hum of a billion villainous minds had been muted. The psychic static that had threatened to erode his sanity was gone, replaced by a profound emptiness. But it wasn't peace. It was the sterile quiet of a perfectly monitored prison, and he was the warden, the guard, and the architect, all rolled into one terrified teenager. He had tried, in the beginning, to simply maintain the status quo. He would passively hold them all in check, a cosmic finger pressed to the lips of evil. But it was an agony of 1,000 cuts. He could feel their impulses, suppressed but still present, like phantoms in his own consciousness. A flash of greed from a white-collar criminal in a Chicago high-rise, contemplating embezzlement. A flicker of violent rage from a disgruntled worker in a German factory, his hand twitching towards a heavy wrench. A surge of cold, predatory hunger from a serial killer in a forgotten corner of Russia, his eyes lingering on a lone pedestrian. Each time, Izuku would have to mentally clamp down, reinforcing the cage, pushing the impulse back into the dark. It was a constant, draining, and intimate battle. He was forced to live, day in and day out, with the dregs of every dark thought from across the multiverse. He was becoming an unwilling expert in the geography of human, and inhuman, cruelty. The sheer, unending torrent of it was eroding him, staining his own heroic soul with its filth. He wasn't sleeping. He barely ate. He walked through the halls of the newly rebuilt UA Heights Alliance dormitory like a ghost, his friends' worried glances bouncing off the invisible wall of his secret. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. He was in the common room, listlessly watching a news special. It wasn't about the Great Surrender anymore. That was old news. This was about the aftermath. The report focused on a small town that had been ravaged during the Paranormal Liberation War. It showed a little girl, no older than Eri, standing in the rubble of what was once her home, clutching a scorched stuffed rabbit. Her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes wide and hollow as she stared into the camera. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. It was as if she had no tears left. The reporter's voiceover spoke of the long, difficult road to recovery, the deep scars left on the national psyche. It spoke of the heroes lost, the families torn apart. It was the cost of their victory. The cost of a world where villains were allowed to exist, to choose to do harm. Izuku looked at the little girl on the screen, and something inside him, something already stretched taut with guilt and horror, finally snapped. His passive containment wasn't enough. It was a reactive measure, a constant, desperate game of psychic whack-a-mole. He was stopping crimes as they were about to happen, but he wasn't stopping the suffering. The scars, the trauma, the memory of pain, those were all still there. The potential for it to happen again, should his will ever falter, was a threat that kept him awake every night. He was drowning in an ocean of cosmic responsibility, and his desperate, heroic heart saw only one way to the surface. He couldn't just cage the monsters. He had to tame them. He had to use this terrible, world-breaking power to create a reality where that little girl would never have to lose her home, where no one would ever have to suffer like that again. He had to justify the monstrous nature of his power by using it to achieve the ultimate heroic ideal. He was racked with guilt, but his desperation was greater. He saw no other way. It was a choice born of profound love for humanity and a profound terror of his own capabilities. He stood up, walked away from the concerned look Uraraka was giving him, and retreated to the solitude of his all-might-themed bedroom. He sat on his bed, the room a shrine to the ideal of heroism he was about to betray. He closed his eyes. This time, it wasn't a tentative probe or a panicked reaction. It was a deliberate, focused act of unimaginable will. He opened his mind, not just to the hum, but to the network itself. He let his consciousness expand, flowing outwards along the billion invisible strings that tethered him to every dark soul in existence. The feeling was terrifying and sublime. He felt the sheer scale of it, a living, breathing nervous system of malevolence spanning galaxies and dimensions, and he was its new, usurper god. For a moment, he felt them all turn to face him in the silent realm of the mind. The mad clown in his cell, the arrogant tyrant on his throne, the patient schemer in his prison, the noseless wizard in his manor, the rage-filled teenager in Tartarus. They all went still, their own thoughts silenced by the arrival of their unseen master. He reached deep inside himself, past the fear and the guilt, and found the core of his being. He found the unwavering, all-consuming desire that had burned in him since he was a child. The very essence of one for all, the will to save. He gathered that feeling, that pure, unadulterated heroism, and forged it into a command. It wasn't a shout. It was a profound, resonant chord of absolute authority, a wave of intent that would wash over all realities. He pushed it out along the network, a single, simple, multiversal decree. Stop. The word was a psychic shockwave, a final, irrevocable judgment. No more killing. No more destruction. No more harm. A final, psychic click echoed across the multiverse, a sound no one heard but Izuku felt in the marrow of his bones. It was the sound of a billion tumblers falling into place, of a billion locks snapping shut, and then, silence. The phantoms in his head were gone. The urges, the flickers of malice, the constant pressure, it all vanished. The network was still there, the connections remained, but they were now inert, placid. He had not just suppressed their will, he had rewritten their fundamental drives. For a single, blissful second, he felt relief. He had done it. He had achieved absolute peace. Then the true, soul-crushing weight of his cosmic transgression settled upon him. He opened his eyes, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass of his window. The face that stared back was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He was the savior of everyone, and the enemy of everything he had ever believed in. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. On the bridge of the Frisia Force flagship, light years away in a galaxy Izuku couldn't name, the tyrant Frisia floated in his hoverpod, a malicious smirk gracing his reptilian features. Below him on the main view screen, the lush, green planet of Xylos filled the view. Its inhabitants, a peaceful, arboreal species, had refused to surrender their world for liquidation. A delightful, if brief, extermination was in order. Lord Frisia, an aide reported, his voice trembling. The Planet Buster cannon is at full charge. Oh, excellent, Frisia purred, raising a single, slender finger. He savored the moment, the exquisite pinnacle of power just before it was unleashed. The terror of the millions below was a palpable, delicious symphony. His finger descended towards the console button that would erase it all. It stopped, a millimeter from the surface. The smirk on his face did not vanish, it simply went slack. The sadistic glee that had been coursing through him a moment before was gone, replaced by a profound and baffling emptiness. He looked at his finger, then at the vibrant green planet on the screen. The desire to destroy it, a desire as natural to him as breathing, had been completely excised from his being. He blinked. What was he doing? Annihilation seemed so pointless, so harmful. He felt a strange, new compulsion. A desire for quiet, for stillness, for thought. Belay that order, he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual arrogant inflection. His subordinates stared at him in stunned silence. Set a course for the barren moon of Qatar 7. I wish to contemplate. His hoverpod turned and drifted away from the console, leaving his entire army in a state of utter, terrified confusion. Lord Frisia, the embodiment of casual cruelty, had just spared a planet to go meditate. In the grand, gloomy dining hall of Malfoy Manor, in a world of magic and shadow, Lord Voldemort raised his wand. His target, a sniveling, captured ministry official, was writhing on the floor, whimpering. The gathered Death Eaters watched with a mixture of fear and admiration. You see, Travers, Voldemort hissed, his voice a sibilant whisper that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Loyalty is everything. Disloyalty must be corrected. Crucio. He felt the familiar, exhilarating rush of power as he channeled the unforgivable curse, the desire to inflict pure, unadulterated agony upon his victim. The curse was halfway to his lips, and then nothing. The rage, the hatred, the cold, burning ambition that was the furnace of his soul, it all just went out. The spell died in his throat. He lowered his wand, a deeply perplexed expression on his serpentine face. He looked at the whimpering man on the floor, and instead of contempt, he felt a strange sense of distaste. For the mess. For the noise. For the sheer, unproductive negativity of it all. He looked past the man, through the tall, mullioned windows, to the gardens beyond. The hedges were overgrown. The roses were wilting. An inexplicable, overwhelming urge rose within him. An urge for order, for cultivation, for quiet, productive work. Bellatrix, he said, his voice strangely calm. The mad witch jumped, her eyes wide. Fetch the gardening shears. The hydrangeas are simply atrocious. He swept out of the room, leaving his followers staring at each other in slack-jawed horror, the whimpering ministry official completely forgotten on the cold stone floor. The change rippled across every reality, a wave of enforced apathy. On Earth, the effects were less dramatic but far more widespread. In a grimy back alley in New York, a mugger holding a knife to a tourist's throat suddenly let go, apologized profusely for the inconvenience, and went to sit on a nearby bench to think about his life choices. In the boardrooms of Tokyo, Yakuza bosses in the middle of negotiating a bloody turf war abruptly ended their meetings, deciding to convert their organizations into charitable foundations. A serial bomber in Paris, his hand on the detonator for a device planted in the Louvre, instead dismantled the bomb and spent the rest of the afternoon admiring the Mona Lisa. The world held its breath, and then let out a collective, confused sigh of relief. Crime rates didn't just plummet, they ceased to exist. Global conflicts ended overnight. Terrorist cells disbanded. Peace treaties were signed with baffling speed. The era of tranquility had begun, but as weeks turned into a month, the unsettling nature of this new world began to show its cracks. It was a world without strife, but it was also a world without struggle. A world without villains, but also a world without the need for heroes. The Hero Public Safety Commission was in chaos. With no villains to fight, heroes were essentially unemployed. Endeavor, the #1 hero, was reduced to giving fire safety demonstrations at elementary schools, his usual fiery intensity replaced by a hollow, confused look. Hawks, the man once too fast for his own good, spent his days perched atop skyscrapers, watching a city that no longer needed him. Pro-heroes, once the pillars of society, became relics overnight. Support industries, costume design, tech development, insurance, all collapsed, sending economies into a tailspin. People were safe, but they were also listless. There was an uncanny, unsettling quiet to the streets. The vibrant, chaotic energy of society had been replaced by a placid, monotonous hum. Humanity, deprived of its darkness, seemed to have lost some of its light as well. There was no ambition, no drive, no great art being made from struggle, no great discoveries born from competition. It was a perfect, safe, and utterly stagnant world. Izuku's friends felt it acutely. Ida, whose entire heroic identity was built on order and justice, found himself in a world with perfect order and no injustice to fight. He threw himself into his studies, trying to make sense of a legal system with no criminals. Uraraka, who became a hero to help her parents, found her family financially secure but felt a deep, gnawing sense of purposelessness. No one felt the wrongness of it all more keenly than Katsuki Bakugo. His world was forged in conflict. His very being was defined by the drive to overcome, to struggle, to win. He didn't just want to be the #1 hero. He wanted to earn it, to fight his way to the top over a mountain of worthy rivals and defeated villains. This placid, sterile world was his personal hell. He found Izuku in one of the Yui training grounds, Gamma Gym. The massive complex was silent and empty. Izuku was standing in the center of the vast space, not training, just standing. He was staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Deku. Izuku jumped, startled. He turned to see Kaken stalking towards him, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face a thunderous mask of suspicion. Kaken, Izuku said, his voice quiet. What are you doing here? Looking for the only damn thing that makes sense in this upside-down world, Bakugo growled, stopping a few feet in front of him. And that's you? What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me. Bakugo snarled, his voice echoing in the empty gym. I'm not one of these extras who just accepts that every bad guy on the planet decided to take up knitting on the same afternoon. I was there. I saw you. I saw what happened to Shigaraki right before you collapsed. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a strange event. Stop lying. Bakugo's voice cracked like a whip. He closed the distance between them in a single, explosive step, grabbing the front of Izuku's shirt. He wasn't using his quirk, but his grip was iron. This isn't peace, you idiot. This is quiet. It's wrong. The world isn't this quiet. There's no fight. No ambition. It's like everyone's been put to sleep. He shook Izuku, his red eyes boring into him, searching for the truth he already knew was there. This has your name written all over it. You're stupid, self-sacrificing, I have to save everyone bullshit. You always take it too far. So you tell me, right now. What did you do? Izuku couldn't meet his gaze. He looked down, his silence a confession. The truth was a razor blade in his throat, and he couldn't force it out. He started, his voice cracking. I just wanted the fighting to stop. Bakugo's grip tightened, his knuckles white. For a moment, it looked like he was going to explode, literally and figuratively. But then, his expression shifted from pure rage to something more complex, something akin to horrified understanding. He had known Deku his entire life. He knew his capacity for reckless, world-breaking self-sacrifice. He finally saw the depth of the darkness in his friend's eyes, the crushing weight he was carrying. He let go, shoving Izuku back. You really are the damnedest fool in history, he whispered, a strange mix of fury and pity in his voice. He turned and stormed away, not saying another word. He didn't need a confession. He had his answer. He didn't know the how, but he knew the who, and right now, that was enough to curdle his stomach. Izuku was left shaking in the center of the empty gym, the silence pressing in on him once more. Bakugo's accusation was a physical blow. The one person who had always seen through him knew. Later that night, unable to face the hollowed-out cheerfulness of the dorms, Izuku retreated to his room. He sat in the dark, feeling the vast, placid network of minds under his control. It was calm. It was orderly. It was perfect. And then, he felt it. It started as a flicker, a tiny point of dissonance so faint he almost missed it. In the perfectly harmonious symphony of his enforced peace, one instrument was playing a sharp, defiant, and utterly wrong note. He focused his mind, his consciousness flying across the globe, following the discordant thread. He found its source in a small, isolated kingdom in Eastern Europe. Latveria. His mental probe descended, phasing through the stone walls of a Gothic castle. He found the mind he was looking for in a vast chamber that was a fusion of a medieval throne room and a futuristic laboratory. There, on a throne of polished steel, sat a man in green robes and a full suit of gleaming metal armor. The mind was a forge. It was a fortress of pure, unadulterated willpower, shielded by arcane energies and powered by incomprehensible technology. Unlike all the others, this mind was not placid. It was raging. It was fighting his command with every ounce of its considerable being. The mental pressure was immense, a psychic battering ram hammering against the cage Izuku had built. Izuku pushed back with his own will, trying to enforce the calm, to smother this pocket of resistance. The effort was immense, and for the first time since issuing the command, he felt a strain. A trickle of blood seeped from his nose. Through the connection, he felt the man's thoughts, not as a violation, but as a broadcast, a declaration of war. In his throne room, Dr. Victor Von Doom threw his head back and roared, his voice a metallic rasp amplified by his mask. The air around him crackled with green energy. Mystical runes glowed on the floor, and Tesla coils lining the walls spat arcs of brilliant blue lightning. He was a being of sheer, indomitable will, and he would not be subjugated. "I feel you, Phantom God!" he bellowed to the empty room, knowing his enemy was listening. "I feel your cowardly, soporific poison attempting to dull my mind, to quell my ambition. You have cast a net of slavery over this pathetic world and countless others, creating a stagnant peace fit only for cattle." He rose from his throne, his armored fists clenched. Arcane energy and cosmic power swirled around him, a visible aura of pure defiance. "But you did not account for doom. This world, this universe, belongs to me to conquer and perfect, not to you to pacify and neuter. I will not be a puppet in your silent play. I will find you, you unseen, cowardly God. And I, Victor Von Doom, will be this reality's liberator." A wave of pure, concentrated willpower, focused like a laser, blasted back along the psychic link. Izuku cried out, clutching his head as a searing pain shot through his skull. He was thrown from his bed, crashing to the floor. The connection was not severed, but it was contested. He lay there, gasping, blood dripping from his nose onto his all-might pajamas. His perfect, orderly peace was a lie. His prison had a flaw, and in a castle thousands of miles away, a will of iron had just sworn to tear it all down. Izuku Midoriya's bedroom, once a sanctuary of heroic aspiration, had become the command center for a silent, secret, and perpetual war. He would sit at his desk, a textbook open to a page on advanced quark theory, and his eyes would see the words, but his mind would be light years away, a beleaguered general fighting on 3 impossible fronts. The strain was a constant, low-grade fever in his soul, a psychic friction that was slowly grinding him down to dust. He had learned, through exhausting and painful trial and error, that his grand command, "Stop harming," was not a simple, self-sustaining program. It was a dam, and the will of the wicked was a relentless, rising ocean. For the common criminal, the petty thug, the garden-variety villain, the pressure was negligible. Their wills were like trickles of water, easily contained. But there were others, beings of such monumental ego, intellect, and sheer force of will that they were not trickles, but raging, powerful rivers, constantly testing the integrity of his control, seeking any crack, any weakness. The first front was a siege. Its theater of war was a mind of iron and sorcery. Dr. Victor Von Doom. The king of Latveria was not merely resisting, he was actively, furiously attacking the psychic cage. Izuku could feel him, a constant, hammering presence. It felt like being locked in a room with a master blacksmith, the clang of a hammer on an anvil echoing endlessly. Doom threw everything he had at the mental barrier. Complex arcane equations designed to unravel psychic constructs, technological frequencies meant to disrupt neurological control, and above all, the sheer, unyielding force of his own belief in his superiority. Every few hours, a new psychic battering ram would slam against the wall of Izuku's will. "I am Doom. I shall not be ruled." The thought was not a plea, it was a statement of irrefutable fact, a law of physics in Doom's own mind. Keeping him suppressed required a significant portion of Izuku's active focus, a mental arm wrestle with a god king that never, ever ceased. The second front was a dissection. It took place in a sterile white prison of the mind, against an intellect so vast and cold it was barely recognizable as human. Sosuke Aizen. Unlike Doom, Aizen did not hammer at the walls. He studied them. He was not trying to break his chains, he was reverse engineering the lock. Izuku could feel Aizen's consciousness, a calm, analytical scalpel, constantly probing the edges of the command. He wasn't fighting the what, he was investigating the how and the who. The thoughts Izuku could sense from him were chillingly detached. The command is absolute, yet it originates from a single point of will. This implies a singular entity, not a cosmic law. The emotional signature is one of desperation and a misguided sense of altruism. Naive. The power scale is multiversal, yet the control is unsophisticated. Brute force. A cannon to kill a fly. Aizen was not fighting Izuku. He was cataloging him, classifying him, learning him. The constant sensation of being observed by that transcendent, predatory intelligence was perhaps more unnerving than Doom's outright hostility. It felt like a game of cosmic chess against a Grand Master who could see 1,000 moves ahead, and Izuku was just trying to remember how the pieces moved. The third front was a battle against inertia, against a will as massive and immovable as a planet. On a quiet, garden world in another reality, the mad titan Thanos sat on a simple stone porch, watching an alien sunset. He had been stripped of his gauntlet and his armies, but not his will. His mind was a universe of stoicism and cosmic philosophy. He did not rage like Doom or analyze like Aizen. He simply existed. His will was a mountain, a force of nature. Izuku's command to do no harm rested upon him like a thin blanket of snow on the peak of Everest. It held, but only just. The Titan's mind constantly contemplated the nature of the force binding him. He saw it as a new, flawed form of balance, an imposition of order without understanding. He did not actively fight it, but the sheer passive resistance of his consciousness required a constant, heavy pressure from Izuku to maintain. If Izuku's focus were to waver for even a moment, he felt Thanos's will would simply shrug off the command as one might shrug off a light rain. This trifold war was Izuku's new reality. He was in a constant state of psychic exertion, and the physical toll was becoming undeniable. He was perpetually exhausted, with deep, bruised-looking circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. When he was particularly strained, trying to reinforce his hold on Doom while simultaneously deflecting Aizen's latest probe, the green lightning of One for All would crackle erratically across his skin, a visible symptom of his inner turmoil. It wasn't the controlled, powerful aura of a hero anymore. It was the frantic, desperate sparking of an overloaded circuit. He would try to eat with his friends in the cafeteria, and his hand would tremble so badly trying to lift a glass of water that he'd have to put it down. Uraraka would ask if he was okay, and he would mumble something about lingering exhaustion from the war. But the lie was wearing thin. He was an island, drifting further and further away from the shore of his own life, and the tide was his own terrible secret. While Izuku fought his silent war, another was brewing in the quietest corners of the world, a war of information and deduction. The greatest minds of this earth, and others, were not idle. They did not believe in miracles. In the pristine, high-tech office at the pinnacle of UA High, Principal Niza stared at a holographic display showing a graph. It was a simple line chart, tracking global crime rates over the past month. The line had been a chaotic, jagged mountain range for decades. Now, it was a perfectly flat, serene plane at absolute zero. It is, to put it mildly, a statistical impossibility, Niza said, his paw stroking his chin as he paced before the display. Across from him, slumped in a chair, was Shota Aizawa. His perpetually tired eyes were even more weary than usual. "I don't need a graph to tell me something's wrong," he grumbled, his voice a low rasp. "You can feel it. The city, it's like it's been sedated. There's no edge. No tension. The ambient noise of potential trouble is just gone. It's illogical." "Precisely," Niza chirped, his usual cheerful demeanor underscored by a chilling seriousness. "Peace is not the absence of conflict, it is the management of it. This is not management. This is cessation. An off switch has been flipped." Aizawa's gaze drifted to the window, his eyes narrowing as he watched a group of students laughing below. His gaze lingered on a familiar shock of green hair. And Midoriya looks like hell. Worse than hell. He looks like a man being haunted. He's carrying something, and it's breaking him. Your observations align with my data, Niza said, tapping a command into his console. The crime rate graph was replaced by a complex energy chart, a chaotic scribble of data centered around the time of the Jaka City battle. A massive, unprecedented energy surge was detected originating from the battle's epicenter. Its signature matches no known quirk. It was psychic in nature, but on a scale that dwarfs any telepath in the registry. And the surge peaked at the exact moment the Great Surrender began. The exact moment young Midoriya was critically injured. Aizawa sat up straighter. You think Midoriya is the source? He is the nexus, Niza corrected. Whether he is the cause, or merely the primary victim who is now broadcasting the effect, is the question we must answer. And to do that, we need a specialist, someone outside our context, who has seen things we can only imagine. He pressed another button. A strange device, a gleaming silver dish cobbled together with wires and what looked suspiciously like parts from Mayhatsum's workshop, began to hum on his desk. It was a prototype, a theoretical device designed to detect and communicate across dimensional fissures. Niza had commissioned it years ago on a theoretical basis. The energy surge from Jaku, however, had briefly weakened the walls between worlds, creating fleeting, unstable wormholes. It was a 1 in a trillion shot. A distorted, static-filled hiss filled the room. Niza typed furiously, calibrating frequencies. I am attempting to contact a consulting detective I have become aware of through a similar, smaller energy event years ago. A man who operates in a world without quirks, but with no shortage of darkness. The static coalesced. The air in front of the dish shimmered, and a holographic image flickered into existence. It was the head and shoulders of a man in a black cowl with pointed ears. His face was a mask of grim resolve, and his eyes, even through the unstable transmission, were sharp and unnervingly intelligent. The background was a cave, filled with the shadows of giant bats and the glow of 100 computer screens. You have 3 seconds to explain this transmission before I trace it and shut it down permanently, a low, gravelly voice growled from the emitter. Aizawa's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Nizu, however, simply smiled his unnerving, cheerful smile. Greetings, Batman, the principal said calmly. My name is Nizu. I believe we have a mutual problem. The conversation was terse, efficient, and terrifying. Batman, his initial suspicion giving way to pragmatic curiosity, listened as Nizu laid out the data. He did not seem surprised by the concept of other dimensions. His acceptance was immediate and absolute. Gotham has been quiet for 34 days, Batman stated, his voice a flat line. Every inmate in Arkham Asylum has ceased all violent and erratic behavior. The Joker is docile. He spends his days painting watercolors of flowers. The city is calling it a divine intervention, a conclusion reached by those who lack the imagination for the alternative, Niza replied. We have cross-referenced the timeline. Your intervention began at the exact same moment as our great surrender. The energy surge you mentioned, Batman deduced. The Nexus. Midoriya, Izuku, Aizawa cut in, his voice rough. He's a student. My student. He's a good kid. Too good. He carries the weight of the world on his shoulders by choice. If he is involved in this, it's not out of malice. Intent is irrelevant when the outcome is global subjugation, Batman countered, his voice devoid of sympathy. You have a world of heroes, advanced technology, and reality-bending powers. How could one boy do this? Niza explained the nature of One for All. A stockpiling quirk, passed down through generations, accumulating power and the wills of its past users. He theorized that Midoriya's near-death experience, combined with his overwhelming desire to save everyone, caused the quirk to reach a singularity, evolving into something new, something no one could have predicted. A psychic amplifier, powered by generations of heroic will, triggered by a self-sacrificial desire, Batman summarized, the pieces clicking into place with audible finality. He didn't just defeat your villain. He rewrote the concept of villainy on a multiversal scale. The cold, blunt statement hung in the air of Niza's office. It was one thing to suspect it, to dance around the edges of the idea. It was another to hear it stated so plainly by an outside observer. "What's your recommendation?" Aizawa asked, his voice tight. "Your world, your problem," Batman said. "But if it were my world, my priority would be containment and assessment. You need to know the scope of his power and the stability of his control. This piece is a house of cards built on the mind of one emotionally compromised teenager. When he breaks, and he will break, the resulting chaos will be catastrophic. You need to confront him. You need the truth." The transmission crackled. "I will continue to monitor from my end. Keep this channel open, Niza. We may need it." The hologram vanished, leaving behind a profound and chilling silence. Aizawa ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion of 100 sleepless nights settling on him at once. "So that's it. We confront him." "Yes," Niza said, his cheerful mask gone, replaced by the grim visage of a commander preparing for an ugly battle. "We need to bring in All Might. Midoriya will not listen to us, not fully, but he might still listen to his idol. His father figure." Niza's small, black eyes were hard as obsidian. "The fate of our world, and perhaps others, depends on it." The summons came that evening. A simple, formal request from the principal's office to meet in secure conference room Alpha, deep in the subterranean levels of UA. It was a room used for disciplinary hearings and meetings of national security. Izuku's blood ran cold. He knew. They knew. He walked through the sterile, metallic corridors, the sound of his own footsteps echoing too loudly. The air grew colder as he descended, the weight of the earth above a fitting metaphor for the pressure on his soul. He opened the heavy steel door. The room was circular, stark, and windowless. The only furniture was a single metal chair in the center of the room and a circular table at which 3 figures sat. Principal Nizu, looking small and imposing behind the vast table. Shota Aizawa, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but intense. And Tashinori Yagi, in his skeletal form, looking older and more fragile than Izuku had ever seen him. The sight of All Might, his mentor, looking at him with such profound sadness and fear, was a physical blow. "Midoriya," Nizu began, his voice calm and even, betraying no emotion. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Izuku walked to the chair in the center of the room and sat down. He felt like a prisoner in an interrogation. The 3 most important mentors in his life were now his inquisitors. Nizu gestured to the wall behind him, which shimmered and became a screen. The first image was the energy chart he had shown Aizawa and Batman. "At 14:30 on the day of the Jaka City battle, we registered an energy event of unprecedented scale," Nizu began, his tone that of a lecturer. He didn't accuse. He simply stated facts. Its epicenter was your precise location. It was psychic in nature. At the exact moment this energy signature peaked, all villainous activity on a global scale ceased. He swiped, and the chart was replaced by dozens of graphs. Crime rates, conflict statistics, even reports of domestic disturbances. All fell to 0, simultaneously, in every nation on Earth. A statistical impossibility. "It is not peace, Midoriya. It is a forced stasis." He swiped again. The screen now showed security footage from the UA hallways. It showed Izuku, stumbling in exhaustion, green lightning flickering from his arm. It showed him clutching his head in the cafeteria. It showed him staring into space for hours at a time. It was a montage of his private agony. "You have not been well," Aizawa said, his voice low and cutting. "You are exhibiting signs of extreme psychic strain. Quirk exhaustion on a level I have never witnessed. You are fighting a battle, even now, as you sit here. We can see it in your eyes." Izuku's hands clenched on his knees. He said nothing. His throat was too tight to form words. "We have consulted with outside specialists," Niza continued carefully. "Individuals who have confirmed this phenomenon is not limited to our world. It is a multiversal event, and you, Midoriya, are the nexus from which it all originates." The evidence was overwhelming, the logic irrefutable. They had laid his secret bare, piece by piece, leaving him with no plausible deniability, no room to lie. He was cornered, trapped by their methodical, relentless truth. He stared at the floor, the silence in the room stretching for an eternity. Finally, it was Tashinori who broke it. He stood up, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. He walked around the table until he was standing in front of Izuku, forcing the boy to look up. All Might's face was a ruin of conflicting emotions: love, pride, terror, and a profound, heart-wrenching disappointment. "We are not your enemies, my boy," he said, his voice soft and trembling with emotion. "Everything we are doing now is because we are terrified for you. Aizawa, Nizu, they see the strategic and logical nightmare you have created. But I just see my boy, carrying a burden that would crush a god, and doing it all alone." He knelt, bringing himself down to eye level with Izuku. The hero who had once stood as a giant now made himself small, a father pleading with his son. He placed a bony hand on Izuku's shoulder. "You have always tried to carry everything yourself. It is your greatest strength, and your most terrible flaw. But you cannot carry this. Not alone. Whatever this is, whatever you have done, we need to know. We need to help you." Tears welled in Tashinori's sunken eyes, tracing paths down his gaunt cheeks. "My boy, please. Tell us the truth." The plea, so full of love and fear, was the final blow. It shattered the dam of guilt and shame that Izuku had built around his heart. The carefully constructed walls of his secret, which had withstood the psychic assaults of gods and monsters, crumbled before a simple, heartfelt request from the man he admired most in the universe. A single, ragged sob escaped Izuku's lips. It was a sound of absolute brokenness. The tears he had held back for weeks finally came, hot and furious, carving paths through the grime of exhaustion on his face. The truth, heavy and poisonous, rose from his soul, ready to finally be spoken, ready to condemn him and change the world forever. The first sob was a crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean of despair. Once it broke, the flood was absolute. Izuku Midoriya, the ninth wielder of One for All, the boy who had stared down armies and monsters, crumpled in on himself in the cold steel chair, his body racked with the kind of deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to tear their way up from the very bedrock of his soul. It was the sound of a boy who had carried the weight of universes in silence, and had finally, catastrophically, broken beneath it. Tashinori's hand on his shoulder was the only anchor in the maelstrom. Aizawa and Nizu remained silent, their faces grim, allowing the storm to run its course. They were not just interrogators, they were his teachers. They understood that this torrent of grief was a necessary prelude to the terrible truth. They had to let him drown a little before they could pull him to shore. Minutes stretched into an eternity in the sterile, soundproofed room. The only sound was Izuku's ragged breathing as he fought to regain control, to force words past the lump of shame and agony lodged in his throat. He finally looked up, his face a mess of tears and mucus, his green eyes bloodshot and haunted with a wisdom no teenager should ever possess. "You're right," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "It's me. All of it. It's my fault." The confession, simple and direct, landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Tashinori's face, already etched with worry, seemed to age another decade. Aizawa's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening. Nizu's whiskers twitched, his sharp, intelligent eyes narrowing as the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Explain," Aizawa commanded, his voice low and devoid of its usual tired drawl. It was the voice he used on the battlefield, the voice of a commander demanding a situation report in the middle of a firefight. Izuku took a shaky breath, the story tumbling out of him in a disjointed, frantic rush. He told them about the final moments of the battle, about being impaled by Shigaraki, the feeling of his life ebbing away. He described the desperate, all-consuming wish: save everyone, stop all the fighting, a prayer screamed into the void. He explained the sensation of One for All changing, twisting, becoming something new. It wasn't a power-up, he stammered, his gaze distant as he relived the moment. It was an opening. A door. My desire, amplified by the quirk, it just broke something. In reality. And my mind, my consciousness, it flooded outwards. He described the silent scream, the horrifying influx of a billion evil minds crashing into his own. He spoke of the flashes of other worlds, of the clown and the tyrant and the sorcerer, his voice trembling as he recalled the psychic violation. "I didn't know what was happening," he pleaded, looking at Tashinori, desperate for him to understand. I just wanted the pain to stop. For everyone. So I pushed back. I commanded them. I told them to stop. He fell silent, the weight of that single, world-altering command settling over him again. Niza leaned forward, his small paws steepled on the table. And this control, Midoriya-kun, is it ongoing? Do you actively maintain it? Izuku nodded numbly. At first, it was passive. But it wasn't enough. There were still thoughts, impulses. The potential for harm was still there. I couldn't let anyone else get hurt, so I issued another command. A permanent one. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. No more killing. No more destruction. No more harm. I took away their choice. The three men stared at him, the sheer, unimaginable scale of his confession slowly dawning on them. This wasn't a quirk that influenced people. This wasn't a temporary pacification. This was the fundamental rewriting of free will on a multiversal scale, orchestrated by the teenage boy sitting before them. You took away their choice, Aizawa repeated, the words flat and cold as slate. He stood up and began to pace, his movements tight and coiled, like a panther in a cage. You took the single most fundamental aspect of sentient existence, the ability to choose one's path, and you erased it. For everyone you deemed a villain, I had to. Izuku cried, his voice cracking with desperation. Don't you see? It was the only way to be sure. The only way to guarantee that no one else would suffer. No more wars, no more dead heroes, no more crying children in the rubble. And what is the cost of this guarantee? Aizawa shot back, whirling to face him, his eyes blazing with a cold fire Izuku had never seen directed at him before. A world of puppets? A society of mindless drones where good only exists because the capacity for evil has been surgically removed? That is not heroism, Midoriya. That is tyranny. It is the very definition of the villainy we fight against, just wrapped in a more palatable, for the greater good package. It's not like that. Izuku protested weakly. They're still, them. They just can't hurt anyone. Prove it, Niza said calmly, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Izuku looked at him, confused. What? Demonstrate, the principal clarified, his black eyes unblinking. Show us the nature of this control. In the sub-level holding cells, we have several captured members of the Paranormal Liberation Front. One, a man by the name of Kensuke Fukui, is currently in Interrogation Room 3. His quirk allows him to manipulate the density of inorganic objects. He is, by all accounts, an unrepentant murderer and loyalist to Shigaraki. Make him do something. Something harmless. Something out of character. The request was cold, clinical, and utterly horrifying. They were asking him to put his sin on display, to perform his monstrous power for them like a circus act. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He wanted to refuse, to scream that he wasn't a monster, he wasn't a puppeteer. But he knew he had to. They had to see. They had to understand the cage he had built. He closed his eyes, shame burning his cheeks. He reached out with his mind, the familiar, now placid network of connections humming at his command. He sifted through the local minds, the ones caged here in this very building, and found the one Niza had specified. Kensuke Fukui. He felt the man's consciousness, a dull, sullen ember of resentment and hatred, currently simmering in a concrete cell. Izuku focused his will. It felt greasy, profane. He wasn't stopping a harmful act. He was initiating one, forcing a man's body to move against his will for no reason other than to prove a point. He shaped the command, not with the grand, sweeping intent of his multiversal decree, but with a fine, sharp, terrible precision. Sing. In Interrogation Room 3, 2 floors below, Kensuke Fukui sat shackled to a metal table, glaring at the one-way mirror. Suddenly his body went rigid. The hateful scowl on his face was replaced by a slack-jawed, vacant expression. His mouth opened, and a sound emerged. It was a strained, tuneless, and utterly soulless rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The man's eyes were wide with a silent, screaming horror as his own vocal cords betrayed him, producing the childish melody against his will. On a monitor in the conference room, the live feed from the interrogation room showed the grotesque spectacle. A hardened killer, a man who had murdered heroes without remorse, was singing a nursery rhyme, tears of helpless rage and confusion streaming down his face. Izuku opened his eyes and released the command. On the screen, Fukui collapsed forward, gasping and choking, a raw, animal sound of violation tearing from his throat. The silence that followed in the conference room was absolute and damning. Toshinori Yagi stared at the screen, his face ashen. The symbol of peace, the man whose entire life had been a testament to inspiring hope and freedom, had just witnessed the most profound perversion of that ideal. He saw the flicker of all for one in Izuku's power, the theft of will, the absolute control. The sacred torch he had passed on had been used to start a fire that had burned down the very concept of heroism. He stumbled back to his chair and sank into it, his body trembling, a look of profound, heart-shattering grief on his face. He looked at Izuku not with anger, but with the inconsolable sorrow of a father who has discovered his son is a murderer. What have you done, my boy?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "This is not saving. This is an erasure." Aizawa was no longer angry. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard dread. He was a pragmatist, a logician. He was looking at Izuku and seeing a strategic and ethical nightmare beyond all comprehension. He saw a well-intentioned child wielding a power that made all for one's ambitions look like petty vandalism. This wasn't a problem to be solved with expulsion or training. This was a crisis on a species-defining level. He looked at Izuku and saw the single greatest threat to freedom the world, and any world, had ever known. Suddenly, another voice joined the fray, sharp and explosive. The heavy steel door to the room slammed open. "I knew it." Standing in the doorway, his uniform immaculate but his face a mask of righteous fury, was Tenya Ida. Behind him, her hands clasped nervously to her chest, was Ochiko Uraraka, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. They had clearly been listening, drawn by the sounds of the confrontation. Ida strode into the room, his movements stiff with outrage. He pointed an accusatory finger at Izuku, his hand chopping the air with furious precision. "I could not believe my ears. Your actions are the ultimate betrayal of the hero's code. We are sworn to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, and to preserve the sanctity of a society built on individual choice and responsibility. You have spat upon every one of those tenets." His voice rose, filled with the passionate, unbending morality that defined him. "You have appointed yourself judge, jury, and jailer for billions. This is not justice. It is the most profound and widespread act of villainy ever conceived." "Ida, wait," Uraraka started, taking a hesitant step into the room. Her gaze was fixed on Izuku, on his tear-streaked face and shaking form. Where Ida saw a crime against philosophy, she saw a friend in unbearable pain. "Deku-kun, why? There is no why that can justify this," Ida declared. "He has committed a heroic heresy." The words, heroic heresy, hung in the air, a perfect, damning summation of the situation. The door was suddenly filled by a much larger, more intimidating figure. Endeavor, the current #1 hero, had been summoned by Nizu as a contingency. He had been listening from the hallway, his face a grim, stony mask. He stepped into the room, his turquoise eyes blazing, not with his usual explosive rage, but with a cold, calculating terror. He understood power, and what he was hearing described a power that made his own flame seem like a child's sparkler. "So, it's true," Endeavor rumbled, his deep voice cutting through Ida's tirade. He wasn't looking at Izuku with moral outrage. He was looking at him the way a man looks at a live nuclear bomb that has been placed in the hands of a child. "You control them all. Shigaraki. The Nomu. Everyone." He took a step closer, his sheer presence lowering the temperature in the room. "The peace we are experiencing is a lie. It is a cage. And you, a boy, hold the only key." His gaze was hard, pragmatic, and utterly terrified. He saw the fragility of it all. One moment of weakness, one emotional outburst from the teenager in front of him, and the cage would break, unleashing a tide of chaos that would drown the world. And then came the final, most explosive confrontation. "Get out of my way, Four Eyes!" Katsuki Bakugo shoved past the protesting Ida, storming into the center of the room like a hurricane. He had clearly followed them, his own suspicions now horribly confirmed. His face was pale beneath his rage, his crimson eyes locked on Izuku. I knew it, he seethed, his voice low and trembling with a fury that went beyond their usual rivalry. This was something deeper, a fundamental violation of his worldview. I knew you were behind this soulless, puppet show piece. He stalked right up to Izuku's chair, ignoring the teachers and the number one hero. He leaned down, his face inches from Izuku's. All my life, Bakugo snarled, I've been fighting. Fighting to be the best. Fighting villains. Fighting you? That's how the world works. The strong win, the weak lose, and everyone chooses what side they're on. You just cheated. You took the game off the board. His voice rose to a roar. You think you're a savior? Look at them. He gestured wildly at the door. They're all looking at you like you're some kind of monster. And they're right. You took away their choice, their fight. You took away my fight. Of all the villains I have ever faced, of all the evil I have ever seen, nothing is more villainous than what you've done. You haven't saved the world, Deku. You've become the greatest villain of them all. Bakugo's words were the final, devastating blow. To be called a villain by his teachers, his friends, it was one thing, but to hear it from Kaken, the person who had been his rival, his measuring stick, his entire life, it broke the last thread of his composure. The room erupted into a cacophony of moral debate and accusation. Ida was shouting about ethics and the rule of law. Endeavor was grilling Niza on containment protocols. Uraraka was trying to plead for understanding, her voice lost in the noise. All Might sat, broken and silent. Bakugo was still yelling, his rage a physical force. It was a schism. The heroes of the world, gathered in one room, were tearing themselves apart over the actions of one boy. Was this forced, soulless peace preferable to the chaos and death that had reigned before? Had Izuku committed the ultimate sin, or made the ultimate sacrifice? He was at the center of the storm, isolated, seen as both a savior and a monster by the very people he had done this to protect. The emotional and psychic turmoil in the room reached a fever pitch. And in his distress, Izuku's control over himself began to slip. The green lightning started to spark erratically over his skin, more violently than ever before. The psychic pressure in the room became immense. The lights flickered. A faint, high-pitched whine began to fill the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Niza's eyes widened. Midoriya! Control yourself. Your emotional state is affecting your output. But Izuku couldn't hear him. He was drowning in the accusations, in the disappointment, in the horrifying truth of what he had become. His power, tied so intrinsically to his emotional state, was beginning to destabilize. And then it happened. The high-pitched whine intensified into a deafening shriek. The air in the center of the room began to shimmer, distorting like a heat haze. A single point of light, impossibly bright and sterile, appeared in the space between Izuku and his accusers. It expanded rapidly, not with the heat of an explosion, but with a cold, absolute presence. A pillar of blinding, sterile white light descended from the ceiling, solidifying in the middle of the room. It was not a quirk. It was not technology. It felt ancient, fundamental, like a law of physics had just gained consciousness and decided to walk into the room. Everyone fell silent, shielding their eyes. The light was so pure it seemed to have no source, casting no shadows. It was the color of absolute, unwavering judgment. From the heart of the pillar, a voice spoke. But it was not a voice. There was no sound. The words were projected directly into their minds, a telepathic broadcast of perfect, cold, and inescapable clarity. The imbalance has been noted. The presence was overwhelming, dwarfing even All Might in his prime. It was the feeling of standing before an ocean, before a mountain range, before the concept of gravity itself. It was vast, impersonal, and absolute. The anomaly will be corrected. The pillar of light receded slightly, revealing a form within. It was humanoid but lacked any discernible features. It was a silhouette carved from pure cosmic law, a being of sterile white energy whose very presence screamed of order, balance, and a purpose so far beyond their comprehension that it bordered on terrifying. Izuku stared at the being, his own immense psychic power feeling like a flickering candle in the face of a supernova. He had broken the rules of the multiverse, and now, the arbiter had come to deliver the sentence.